Hello, everyone. My name is Mililma May, and I brought my dad here. He's sitting in the front, Lenny May, to all of you. And we are Gulumbrink and Dungalaba people from the Batcho family, which make up one of the 8 family groups defined by the Northern Land Council as Larrakia people. And we are gathered here today on my grandmother's country, my father's mother's country. My family have hunted, created, and shared knowledge on and with this country for millennia. The event you are privileged to hear from today is significant. And it is significant because we are coming together to share knowledge with care and conviction. This is significant because it is part of an ancient practice that has taken part on my grandmother's country many, many times before. We must not take this moment for granted. The knowledge we are sharing and learning about today will equip all of us with more tools to do what us mob collectively are meant to do, and that is to care for people and country. What you to do throughout this session is to look around and be reminded that you have each other to lean on. Community and collective care is the way my people made care sustainable over millennia, and we can practice that here today. I'm not here to welcome you to my grandmother's country because you're already here and it's too late. That's a joke from my dad. But I do welcome you to listen with eagerness and determination. I welcome you to learn the critical information that you will hear today to help empower our communities and our people. I welcome actions and not complacency. My old people taught me that it is part of our due diligence to learn as much as we can about people and countries so that we can sustain this place for millennia to come. As a Gulumbrink Dungalaba Tiwi person, I know that we are intellectuals and nurturers, and it is the brilliant combination of these two values that have crowned us the oldest living culture in the world, continued living culture. Today is about bringing together intellect and nurturing. And I want to thank Louise and Mark for inviting me and for organising this presentation, and to all of the people who made sure that it happened. I really respect the courage and decency of all of you who fought to learn this from this session today. And I thought I'd mention as well that if this presentation does bring up anything for you or you find it triggering, to make sure you spend time with country. Country is our biggest teacher, and we can sit by the ocean or walk through the bush or admire the sunset to look after ourselves when we're hearing this kind of information. Knowledge and care go hand in hand. Intellect and nurturing go hand in hand. So thank you for your time and take care.
Hi everyone. So Mark and I just wanted to introduce Professor Melissa Haswell. She is the author of the report that is there on the table. She's a professor of practice in environmental wellbeing in the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Strategy and Services, and the Honorary Professor in the School of Geosciences at the University of Sydney. She's also a Professor of Health, Safety and Environment in the School of Public Health Social Work at Queensland University of Technology. She has over 30 years experience in public, environmental and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and wellbeing research and education. She is our expert here, and Mark and I have been learning a lot from her over the last number of months, and we really welcome her here to Darwin, travelled all the way from Brisbane. So thank you, Melissa. My name's Louise Woodward. I'm a lowly paediatrician working in this institution. I'm not nearly as esteemed as the wonderful Melissa. Souza, as you all know, is an ED physician and also has been greening our hospital and trying to address and mitigate the effects of climate change around our hospital as well. And we also have online one of the other authors of this report, the Emeritus Professor David Schumann as well. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Lou. So our presentation is going to consist of two parts. The first part I'll present, which is going to be giving everyone a quick whistle-stop tour of what's proposed in the Beetaloo Basin regarding hydraulic fracturing and what the gas processing hub is going to look like in the manufacturing at Middle Arm. And then we'll pass over to Melissa and Louise to talk about the health impacts specifically. And during the panel discussion, I'm sure there'll be opportunity for the audience to ask questions of the experts in the room. So the Beetaloo Basin, for those who don't know, is an area that's about 500 kilometres south of Darwin, and it encompasses an area that's about 2.8 million hectares. And the key towns in the area, it's south of Katherine, and it's the area between Mataranka and Elliot. The important things to note is that the Beetaloo Basin is a geological term, and of relevance is its relationship to the Cambrian limestone aquifers that are very much at the surface of this area. And there's a lot of interest into what might be the impacts to the aquifer for human, environmental, and pastoralist use. The fracked gas, the hydraulically fractured gas from the Beetaloo, is then proposed to be piped by new pipelines and numerous other infrastructure to Darwin, where the Middle Arm hub is proposed to be developed. Now, this hub has been documented by the Territory Economic Reform Commission back in 2020 to one of the 2020 documentation of the manufacturing and processing of that area are these particular petrochemicals. The LNG that's brought up needs to be purified and liquefied for export overseas. It's predominantly an export industry. Ammonia, urea, ethylene, methanol, these are all things that are produced from the fracked gas and have various derivations that will be made of them, together with some other fertilizers, plastics, those sorts of things. And we've heard about potential hydrogen industry coming through and the linkage of this site with lithium and other critical minerals as a separate industry, but being dealt with at Middle Arm. And the exact layout of what's happening at Middle Arm is still not decided upon. It's important to note that there hasn't been any health impact assessments done on any of these specific industries at Middle Arm. And a very important relevance is that the distance of Middle Arm from Palmerston, which will be 3 kilometres, and the Darwin CBD, which will be 5 kilometres. And the relevance of that will be brought out in the second part of our talk. The carbon dioxide that's going to be produced as a byproduct from processing, but also from the Barossa gas hub offshore near the Tiwi Islands, which has again been in the news recently. There's a large amount of CO2 there. That CO2 needs to be dealt with. There's a carbon sequestration and storage proposal where that gas, that carbon dioxide, gets piped to offshore waters of the Timor Sea, known as the Bayu Undan field. That's a depleted gas reservoir. It's nearing the end of its life as a gas producing hub, and it's proposed that the CO2 will be sequestered there. And there's a lot of debate as to what the potential efficacy of that may be, given the Gorgon plant's success with the same technology in Western Australia. And that's something for a different discussion. The emissions from the Beetaloo Basin are predicted at about 1.4 billion tonnes over its life cycle, which is equivalent to about 22% of Australia's annual emissions as they stand now. So, getting back to the Beetaloo Basin, what does fracking look like as a process? As opposed to conventional gas, as you can see here, there's a little red triangle. There are pockets of gas which are nearly depleted around the world. Pretty easy to sink a well or two in these areas because they're very condensed, very small footprint. Unconventional offshore gas involves a massive footprint because shale gas, which is the gas that's in these coal seams or the shale formations, a geological formation, the gas is distributed over a very large area. And this process of hydraulic fracturing involves drilling a well at least 1 kilometre down to access this strata, and then horizontal drilling 3 to 4 kilometres. Once the drill, and so there's a massive footprint. You need hundreds to thousands of wells to deal with an area and to make it profitable. And we know that the Beetaloo Basin, there are around 6,000 wells proposed for this area south of Katherine. There's a lot of continuous noise as a result of the processes which I'll show you now. So it's not a matter of drilling a well which is very noisy and then having things tapped. There's a continuous noise pollution in the area. And so going a little bit more into detail, just so you understand the process, a well is drilled vertically and horizontally, a series of steel pipes are dropped down, and near the surface, some concrete casing, which is supposed to stop the water tables which are in this area from being accessed in an ideal situation. And then the very end of these horizontal pipes are perforated. Detonations are created at the very end of the pipe to cause fracture lines through this shale formation. And then hydraulic fracturing fluid is forced down at very high pressure through this pipeline to open up the fracture lines and allow gas to be collected in the pipe and taken to the surface. These detonations have to occur repeatedly to get the flow happening. The amount of water that's needed for each well is in excess of 20 to 30 million litres per well, and some documentation's up to 60 million litres or megalitres. Once the flow is happening, then flow can occur over years to decades, depending on how things are going. The gas comes up with fracking fluid that's been sent down, but also the shale water that's bathing this area and has been in contact with fossil fuels for millennia. And there's a lot of concern about the components within the shale water that are being brought to the surface and in close proximity to humans, ecosystems, and groundwater. Once the water and the gas comes up, the dewatering occurs, holding tanks, shallow ponds, and various uses. The gas is then held, transported by pipe, and moved off. It's important to note that there are significant fugitive emissions in the gas process, mining process. There's a process of flaring where there's a deliberate burning of methane and other combustible gases to move the very global warming methane into a less warming CO2, but still a greenhouse gas, and deliberate venting. Things are just let off into the atmosphere to control pressure in the system, because explosions would be quite bad in this environment. After the well is come to the end of its life, in decades, decommissioning occurs where there's so-called plugging of the well, and then all of this infrastructure is abandoned. It's been shown in the US situation that ongoing leakage of methane and other greenhouse gases occurs from the abandoned infrastructure. This is what one fracking well looks like, and you need to repeat this 100 to thousands of times in the site. And here's an image from a Pennsylvanian fracking region showing, a landscape affected by fracking. Just getting back to the water, the Cambrian limestone aquifers is the general name given to the three big aquifers that are in the area, and of particular note, the Wiseau and the Georgina are the most important. The Daly more north isn't so implicated in this. It's really important to note that all the mapping formed on behalf of government shows that there is interconnectedness between these aquifers, so they should be considered as one, plus the limestone strata is very porous and on a geological level. There's also been documentation in government reports that there are significant knowledge gaps about where this connectivity between aquifers occurs and potentially between in various regions, and where the water is discharging and how and where it's recharging to be used by on the surface. And specifically, the Georgina Wiseau water allocation plan was only announced 10 days ago by the Northern Territory government. That proposes to liberate 210 billion litres per year of water for use by fracking and industrial agriculture, compared to the baseline of 15 billion litres used a year by all comers in the region. So that's community needs, agribusiness, and local businesses. Of important note is that there's a lot of criticism from scientists, from water scientists, that river flows to the Roper, to the Flora, Mataranka Hot Springs, Bitter Springs, all of these areas that are iconic landscapes for recreation and tourism. But these are also ancient, significant and sacred sites for Indigenous people. This is an arid area of the Northern Territory, and of course these areas have become very culturally important for Indigenous people. So there's a lot of concern that this amount of allocation is going to impact flows in this area. It's also going to drop the water table and affect groundwater dependent ecosystems whose trees can only access several decades of meters down, and the proposed drop may drop the aquifer down by 50 to 100, or it's probably going to drop the aquifer by 50 to 100 meters. So there's a great concern that there's going to be massive die-off of groundwater dependent ecosystems throughout the allocation of water. Fracking fluid itself, that's the stuff that the operators put down the well, have a lot of commercial in confidence protections about telling us what's in them. But from North American literature, we know that there's a raft of chemicals, and it's also highly saline. And salinity at the surface can be very toxic for living systems. So that's a great concern, but plenty of components that are used to help lubricate the drill bits, to encourage flow and prevent clagging and oxidation of the metalwork and the concrete. But the shale water, the water that's bathing this area where the gas is, contains numerous radioactive chemicals, heavy metals, and a lot of volatile organic compounds, including the BTEX group, which the lists of them will trigger in public health experts and paediatricians, a recognition of how toxic these things are in living systems, and of course PFAS, which has had some infamy in the Greater Darwin area and Catherine Tyndall area. It's interesting to note that industry is in the US has used the effluent water on site for things like dust suppression, to water cattle, and in agriculture. And the Northern Territory government is proposing to have greater regulation around the fracking industry regarding its water use. Again, the American evidence shows many pathways by which our water use and water quality can be impacted through fracking, and we've listed them here. Some of these things are deliberate use and also accidental uses. And the Haswell report, which we provided copies of here and is available online through University of Sydney, provides some data around exactly what the US rate of adverse contaminations have been. Of course, only 2 months ago in August, in the exploratory well in the Beetaloo operated by this operator, there was a media report about effluent water deliberately being used to spray on the ground, and there was a reply by the industry body saying that this was actually not a concern and it was safe enough to be consumed by cattle. So that's your whistle-stop tour of fracking in the Beetaloo, the Middle Arm precinct, and the carbon sequestration. I'm now going to pass you over to Louise and Melissa to talk about the health impacts of these.
Thank you so much, Mark. So up here on your screen, there is a QR code. I'd encourage you all to access the report through the QR codes on your phone. I'll leave it up there for a few seconds. And then you've all got a copy then of this report, which is 104 pages long, that you can read in your leisure. It's obviously been quite a tricky thing to try and distill the report down into 5 or 10 minutes. And so there's a lot more to say about the report, and certainly we'd be very willing to answer any questions that anyone has at a later date about the report after you've read it. Okay.
Hi, everyone. This slide is just showing you sort of the history of research on unconventional gas and health impacts and environmental impacts over the years. So you can see how rapidly this literature has grown from just a few papers in 2010 to over 2,000 in 2021. There's a whole lot more in 2022, and in doing this review, a whole lot more in 2023. So the research literature here has become very, very mature compared to its early years. But I'll just show you here that across Australia, there's been a lot of flirtation with unconventional gas. Particularly, it's grown in Queensland, but different inquiries, different reviews occurring in New South Wales, South Australia, Northern Territory here, WA. But what you can see here, what I want you to see here is that literature is constantly growing, and there's constantly more and more being found out about the industry, and more elegant studies, which I'll show you one example later on. So since the preparation of this report at the request of the pediatricians, and to update a report that Professor Sherman and I wrote back in 2019, we said, sure, we can update that report. We didn't realize what a huge job that was, to be able to digest all those studies from 2021, 22, 23. But very recently, after the completion, we sent the report to the International Society for Environmental Epidemiology, ISEE, which is really our peak body of environmental epidemiologists, which this kind of research is actually particularly under that discipline. And the chair of the Ethics and Philosophy Committee, Dr. Ruth Etzel, agreed to do this review. And just to show very quickly, her comments about the report were that as a pediatrician, she's also a pediatrician, I paid special attention to the sections on childhood diseases and exposures. And overall, I think it is a tour de force, and I congratulate the authors on a comprehensive review of the risks to human health of oil and gas development. And I just wanted to show here, for people's interest, is that this committee under the International Society has just released new guidelines for ethics for environmental epidemiologists. So I really did. It's not even on the website yet. They were published and they were approved by the society in September 2023. I think it's really important because it really shows us where we're at with regards to this industry and the kinds of research literature that's coming out now.
So in terms of the health impacts of the fracking chemicals that I guess Mark talked about in terms of the fracking fluid, these chemicals enter our environment through water, soil and air, and they also end up in our food chain. And they end up in our food chain through getting into the air, water and soil, through fish, cattle, and everything else that relies on the ecosystems to survive. And these chemicals are known carcinogens, reproductive toxins and teratogens, developmental toxins, neurotoxins, endocrine disrupting chemicals, and also those forever chemicals that Mark was talking about, the PFAS chemicals. These all end up in the environment, and they affect populations who live near oil and gas industry, and that can be fracking, pipelines, gas processing, and where it's relevant to us here today, we're talking about populations in the fracking zone. We're also talking about population here in Darwin, because we live in a gas processing zone. And Middle Arm will only expand that. We already have gas processing in our town. So in terms of the health effects that we see, we're seeing increased asthma exacerbations and severity in populations living around gas the gas industry. And you can see I've just listed a number of the recent high quality studies that show this. There's increased markers of chronic disease and other diseases. So cardiovascular disease tends to be exacerbated, respiratory disease, migraines, people get sinus irritation, fatigue, eye irritation, which can relate to pollutants getting into the lungs and the bloodstream and affecting the whole body. And there are areas, you know, with higher blood flow that tend to be affected significantly, like the lungs, the sinus areas, etc. There's increased hospitalisation rates for people with chronic disease. So we see this in populations. So they're more likely to be hospitalised for their heart disease, their respiratory disease, their neurological disorders. And there's been a lot of studies to show this. There's also increased mortality and reduced life expectancy from chronic disease and cancer. And that's particularly relevant to us here in the Northern Territory, where a lot of our patients suffer from chronic diseases, and they may not die from air pollution. They will die from their heart attack or their asthma or their diabetes, but all contributed to by pollution. And that really is starting to be recognised more and more around the world. There's certainly been some articles coming out in the UK about air pollution. There's also an increase in all-cause mortality for populations, and you can see a number of studies there, and certainly Melissa is going to present one of the studies in more detail on that. There's an increase in sexually transmitted infections, and this is due to the large number of fly-in fly-out workers and increased workers coming to sites of fracking, gas processing, etc. And there's also, this is extremely important, the mental health and psychological stress of communities living amongst fracking and gas processing. As Mark discussed, it's this constant noise. There's lots of movement to and from the fracking wells, and it really is, you know, makes a huge difference to the country that people depend on for their psychological well-being as well as their health. And there's a number of studies showing that. So in terms of, I guess, my area of interest being mothers, infants and children, they are heavily impacted by this industry. So there's increased antenatal depression and anxiety. There's significant increases in preeclampsia of about 26%, as well as hypertension in pregnancy. There's some really strong evidence showing reduced birth weight in populations living around fracking and gas processing areas. There's also a high frequency of preterm births and spontaneous miscarriage. There is significantly increased birth defects, including congenital heart disease, anencephaly, spina bifida, and gastroschisis. We have to evacuate out a lot of our babies with congenital heart disease and other serious birth defects, and we already have a very overburdened NICU and certainly cannot cope with any more. One of the you know, really frightening things as well is the higher incidence of leukemia, and that is really strong evidence across a whole range of the gas fracking and processing area, as well as the production of petrochemicals. We're seeing increased incidences of a number of different types of leukemia, actually in all ages, but they particularly affect children. And there's more research going on now about hematological malignancies and the gas industry. So I wanted to bring up a study, particularly when looking at the petrochemical manufacturing that is going to be occurring at Mililma using fracked gas as the feedstock. Petrochemical manufacturing is really toxic for surrounding communities, and there's an emerging body of strong evidence showing this. So as you can see, this is a systematic review and meta-analysis of hematological malignancies in residents living near petrochemical facilities. This was released in 2020. And you can see there on the graph that the rates of leukemia are really high and much higher than would be expected if there were no petrochemical facilities there. And that evidence is quite, I find, quite alarming and strong. You can see there's 187,000 people in this meta-analysis. You can see the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is kind of approaching significance, and you know, potentially over time that may get worse as more time passes with the population exposures. You can see that Hodgkin's lymphoma is not significant, or multiple myeloma. And there's a lot of research going in now, particularly with the amount of petrochemical facilities and manufacturing in the United States. And there is more evidence emerging all the time. This slide didn't work. Go again. Okay. So in terms of, there we go. Okay, hang on. Yeah, sorry. So in terms of the leukemia risk for people living within 5 kilometres of a petrochemical facility, that is Mililma, there's a 30 to 58% increased risk of leukemia, and you can see Palmerston CBD is 3 kilometres from Mililma and Darwin CBD is 5 kilometres from Mililma, and that is obviously as the wind blows, and I find that quite concerning. I'm going to hand over to Melissa.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things I did want to point out in terms of the elegance and the rigor of the studies, especially as we come into the 2020s to the 2023 currently, and I wanted to provide just one example of this. It was looking at all-cause mortality and Medicare beneficiaries across the United States. So you can see here that the authors are from the Chan School of Public Health, Harvard University. So they looked at 15 million Medicare beneficiaries. They looked across all the different shale gas plays, as you can see there in the red and yellow. And they included, this was just a mammoth piece of work where they used the methods of Cox proportional hazards model and differences in differences, which is an approach that comes from health economics, which has really started to enhance the rigor of the associations being seen as being linked to the gas industry operations. So in this case, they looked at not only distances from wells, but also the wind directions. So you can see there with those little red arrows just as a representation. So they looked at using this as a way of looking at what differences in mortality risk did they find that were associated with not just distance, but also the direction of the winds, which would only be looking at air pollution being carried by the from the industries. And just to show you, there's just 3 graphs here from the paper showing the increase in hazard ratios, or the incidence of these of mortality occurring in relation to proximity to gas development operations. On the bottom, we see that this difference that we see as a line going upwards for distance, It starts after the drilling, so before the drilling occurring in those locations, there was no mortality difference. Then you see that upward line that not only goes up rather rapidly and steeply, it also persists over the years of the operations in progress. So this particularly shows us the temporality. The drilling came first, and then the health impacts came after. And then this diagram here shows some of the elegance where they're looking at the triangles are showing distance or exposure measure downwind from the operation. So you can see the increased hazard ratio for mortality, particularly strong where you're downwind, but also significant upwind as well. So that there are other mechanisms through water, as we've heard before, potentially exposed, as well as the overall stress and distress that is also very, very prominent in the literature. So it's not just the physical exposures we're talking about, it's combined with the massive disruption of their communities and the grief and loss that can often come from seeing your community change, seeing the landscape change, etc. So this is just one example of the elegance of the work, not only in quantity of research, which I showed you initially, but also in the quality. It would be hard to explain this as some kind of confounder that happens to be upwind, but not downwind in terms of distance. There's also similar studies, particularly in the reduced birth weight, etc., showing the similar things with the groundwater flow underneath. So from the gas infrastructure, upstream less, downstream more. So this is the maturity of the literature that we're increasingly seeing now.
And so, as some of you probably know, there is currently a middle arm Senate inquiry that will be looking into the middle arm facility and the gas processing that will occur there. And there's been quite a number of submissions. I think it's over 120 submissions, with a high number of submissions from health organisations. And I've just put this one up from the College of Physicians. The inquiry must recognise the health harms of fossil fuels, both directly and through the contribution of fossil fuels to climate change. Projects that extract or use fossil fuels or support the extraction or use of fossil fuels are a threat to the health of local communities and to the health of populations across the globe being affected by climate change. The inquiry should do everything it can to ensure that health harms that could arise from middle arm are prevented. And these are some of the health organisations that have put in submissions to the inquiry. And there's also been a number of individuals that have put in submissions, some of whom from this hospital. And in terms of the United States, where this industry has matured, the American Academy of Paediatrics has put out a statement. Therefore, to protect the health of children and all people against the known, and that's a really important term, the known and still undiscovered hazards of unconventional natural gas extraction. The practice should be banned by law or regulation until ample evidence demonstrates that it can be done without jeopardising the health of communities in which it occurs, particularly through its potential to contaminate water supplies. Much more attention should be given to natural gas infrastructure, including pipelines, to limit leaks that contribute to greenhouse gas accumulation and worsening climate change. I'd like to finish with this beautiful quote from Mililma.
There's something in all of us that makes us want to protect country. It's a human thing. It's universal.